We have three industry experts in cybersecurity and security here today, and technology in general. I'll introduce these members, and then they'll have a little 2-3 minute dialogue each. Then we've got a couple of questions which we'll get going with right away, and then I'll open it up to anybody to ask questions. And that's going to be the format of it, very casual, and it's an Ask Me Anything. To my immediate left right here is Scott Cragg, and Scott's the founder and managing partner of Reef, a cybersecurity consulting firm right now with expertise especially in federal government and security in the military. Scott had a very successful career which culminated as the CIO of the US Secret Service. To his left is Jeff Schwartz. Jeff is the Vice President of Security Engineering at Checkpoint Software Technologies. And as an industry veteran with responsibilities in managing all the technical aspects of operating a team of 200 engineers at Checkpoint and managing a customer base of approximately $900 million across the Americas. Jeff advises mostly Fortune 500. And to his left, we have Mike Balboni, who is the founder and managing partner of Redland Strategies, which is a consulting firm with expertise in homeland security and specialties in many areas, including healthcare and state government, having successfully tenured as the former Homeland Security Advisor for the New York State with responsibilities in writing Homeland Security laws after 9/11. Why don't we start, since we're in linear fashion here, with you, Scott. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you got in you into such an interesting role for you.
Sure. Sounds like it's on. Thanks for the intro. Appreciate it. I always seem to pick the wrong seat. I don't know why that is. As Eddie mentioned, one of the posts I had most recently was as the Secret Service CIO. Most recently, took a jump into federal financials as the CIO, CTO at the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. Actually started my career as an aerospace engineer working on weapons platforms and carrier aviation. So I'm an aerospace engineer. And made the transition into IT about midway through my career. What I find interesting about that is that I have brought with me that engineering background, that systems think, and coupled with the rather large federal programs that I've been part of or around, maybe I'm stamped or tattooed or maybe scarred by the way I came up through engineering and IT. But hopefully my perspectives will be interesting to you. Also spent some time in the intelligence community as part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus and a couple other things as well. So with that,
over to Jeff.
Back to you.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I've been in the vendor community for some time. When I started at Checkpoint Software in 1999, certainly the threat landscape and the security space itself was much more of a static or predictable environment. Obviously, things have progressed quite substantially, and it's, from my perspective, there's never been a more exciting time to be in the cyberspace. And both the threats and the technologies and innovations being brought to bear to impact those threats have never been more compelling, and it's appreciate the time to come here and speak with you guys. Thanks.
So my name is Mike Balboni. Mike. And I'm probably someone that you do not normally hear from, because I couldn't configure a firewall to save my life. I am not a cyber, quote, expert in terms of being able to configure things. What I do is I explain stuff. In fact, if you just watched CNN this afternoon, I was on about the Vegas shootings. I do Homeland Security services for CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. And so I have a very interesting position of trying to say why things matter and what are the ways forward. I also serve on the board of directors of the George Washington Homeland Security and Cybersecurity Advisory Group. It's a think tank in DC. And so what I also do is I do the operational side from the C-suite. And I essentially put teams together to respond to breaches. I had a financial client that I love just quickly telling this story. They were migrating data, and they were going from MasterCard to Visa, and they pushed the button and they put it on an unsecure site. And for 30 days it resided on there. And then, everyone was like, with Fibic, you're like, what? Yeah, and this was a bunch of years ago. And then the way they found it was the son of one of the board of directors called his father up and said, Dad, I just went into my accounts and they're not on the site of the financial institution. So you must be wrong. No, here it is. So anyway, they all go crazy, and then I'm brought in to basically run the response. And just a little bit of a practice note. If you're working with a client that's in an emergency mode, my strongest suggestion to you is be in the room, because we get the smartest people from the different agencies and companies that would want to advise the company at a time of incredible stress. And if you can't see the body language of the people you're talking to, you can have the perfect answer. If they're not getting it, it goes nowhere, and it's really not of any use. So that's what I do. I basically translate. As I was a state senator, and back Senator DeCarlo's with me, my former colleague. And so I spend my whole life talking about ideas and trying to tell people this is why it matters and this is why it doesn't. So it's great to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, let's stick with that theme, Mike. If you were to pitch to a large organization, what's the best way for them to increase their cyber resiliency? What would you say to them? Right? How can these organizations beef up that resiliency?
So I've had great conversations with, I originally thought I had this brilliant idea. I'd go to the insurance companies. I'd talk to the insurance companies and I'd say, all right, so what programs do you have, and what kind of training do you do, and how do you make sure that the people who pay you money are going to actually keep paying you money and get more cyber aware and more cyber secure? And so I went and spoke to AIG, and they had a fascinating perspective. Like, yeah, we insure lots and lots of people, and we offer services as to how to get people prepared. You'd be astounded how many people don't take them up on it. And so I studied this, and I work with a lot of very big companies. And when you go talk to the folks at the higher levels, here's what they'll tell you. We understand that there's a cyber risk out there, and we're going to hire people to try and manage that for us. But in terms of what we pay attention to day to day, we got to keep the trains running. We got to keep the product running. We have to make sure that our customers are safe. And so cybersecurity has not yet bubbled up to the position where I'm going to go and invest in it. It's still a cost center and not a profit driver. That's the reality of it. Until Target, until Equifax. But when you think about it, take the Target one. If you watch what happens at Target shares, they've kind of recovered from this. People still shop there. Let's see about Equifax. But Equifax's response is as much as the problem as what initially happened. They really blew the response. And I think we talked to them inside. And funny, I was on Fox 2 days ago, the Maria Bartiromo show, and we talked about that. And what's fascinating about Equifax is that their counsel was the person who was in charge of the cyber. And everyone sits there and says, why would you have an attorney in charge of your cyber operations? They had a CISO, but it reported to the attorney, not to the board of directors. And that's really what I'll answer your question with this statement. In order to make cyber matter in a corporation, the CEO has to own it. The CEO has to own it, which means that if you're given protocols, this is how you use the system, and if you don't use the system, and if you cause damage, you're gone. Until you get that kind of buy-in, and of course providing resources towards it, it's still going to be something that's amorphous within the corporate culture.
Well, and so Jeff, answer this question then. So we see these things like Equifax Company News. It looks like from the outside that things are getting worse. From a technology perspective, what can these companies do while they don't have that CEO buy-in and with limited amounts of, let's say, muscle within the organization? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so the problems continue to get worse for a couple reasons. If you subscribe to IDC, security spending's up 9% year over year. If you subscribe to the Verizon Breach Data Investigations Report, the volume of threats have increased 40% year over year. And that's not to take into account the increased level of sophistication with any of those threats. So putting those two data points together, every dollar we spend on security is producing less rate of return than it did last year. Put differently, the ball of yarn is unwinding as we pull the string. So these problems don't seem to be getting worse. They are getting worse, and they will continue to do so until a couple things happen. One, as Mike was just describing, people don't care. So enough people don't care enough to change the pattern of inertia that exists with technologies today. And the second issue, aside from this attribution and ownership of the problem, is organizations continue to invest in point solutions. They have a problem, they solve that discrete problem, independent of the rest of their environment and independent of the overall security operations. And we see this manifest itself through the fact that there's literally 1,000 security vendors in the cyberspace now. And organizations are kicking the tires on many, if not all of them. And the challenge is that organizations lack the operational capacity to consume the technologies they already have. And they have these point solutions that are spread out all over the environment. And it's also contributing to the lack of scale that as organizations push to move to the cloud and hybrid cloud infrastructure, that moving this big, expensive, robust security stack that lives on in their traditional IT environment, moving that to the cloud is one, not practical, two, not realistic in most cases. So organizations have evolved organically into this cadre of point solutions that it slows down operations, it reduces visibility in areas that it's supposed to increase it, and it exacerbates the perception that IT is slow and non-responsive. So what organizations can do about it is focus on the operational issues that they're in an environment and in a situation that they can properly consume with the people and resources they have, and leverage the vendors that can consolidate some of those technologies to allow them to be more portable to other environments like cloud and public infrastructure like IoT and other space as the needs of the business evolve, not based on this traditional one foot in front of the other, traditional IT process.
So there are problems with scale, and let's take it to the ultimate scale, big government. Scott, you've spent your career working with big government. Where do we go? Whether you've seen a myriad of scenarios from a large-scale customer perspective, how are we going to tackle this problem?
Well, I liked where you were going with that question until the last few words. How are we going to tackle this problem? It's a great question.
Really, are there more themes, right? Is there a theme that you could plug through a large-scale organization that might help adopt technologies and the right attitudes?
Well, let's see where this meandering goes, and we'll let the audience decide. I'm going to make some comments, and I appreciate everything that Jeff and Mike have just said. So let me draw my DoD background in a little bit. To Jeff's comments about point solutions, if I look at where I was 30 years ago in DoD, what we were looking for were not only countermeasures and capabilities I was in naval aviation. We were looking for point solutions, but we were also evolving the way we looked at engineering challenges. And in aviation back in the 60s, airplanes started to become platforms, okay? And aviation changed dramatically with sensors and other capabilities. I think that's where we are right now. Now, the reason why I'm framing it this way is I'm going to challenge you this way. I think what's important and what's changing and what's critical to customers right now is the aspect of situational awareness. All right, that's a managerial and intellectual evolution I think we require. What I mean by that is features and capabilities are very, very important. But the pace of the threat scenarios, attack surfaces, and the way the adversaries are coming at us, you first have to understand what the ecosystem is telling you and the ecosystem that you're in. In my book, if you're not situationally aware, and that could take operations into it as well as cyber and all resources as well, including partners, if you're not situationally aware of the ecosystem or the environment you're in, given the myriad of threats that are out there, how do you ever prioritize and decide where you put your next investment of time, okay? Becoming so focused on a capability or a feature or a point solution, as Jeff was talking about, is potentially going to cost you if you pick the wrong basket to put your eggs in. If you look at island hopping during World War II, there was no complete win. There was no immediate victory for the United States Navy. They went from island to island to island. You can't solve every problem immediately. I think the lessons learned on the kinetic battlefield in the past of how campaigns and wars were fought There are parallels to the way cyber needs to start. We need to start to understand how to react to the cyber threat. There is no point solution. I need to know who's in the room, how big the room is, who my partners are, what they can provide, because I can't answer every call. And I've got to be able to find and identify priorities that I can deal with. So this perhaps is not a question about cyber itself, but it's about those who are customers, who define requirements, understanding that it's more than just the feature or the capability. It's the systems thinking that goes into combining all of those capabilities and how you deploy your assets. Now we know this, right? We all know this. If we're sitting across from each other one-on-one at a table having a cup of coffee, we'd get to this conversation. But it's also a managerial leadership and intellectual capacity that you have to embrace and make part of the way you digest your thinking and then go in and proceed with solution architecting. Hopefully that makes sense. Happy to talk about it more, but let me truncate it there. I could go on for way too long.
Yeah, well, let's get into questions from the audience then to see if you want to walk down this rabbit hole or if you want to take our dialogue somewhere else.
We scared them.
Ask me anything. Don't be scared. I don't mind the silence. I used to be an English teacher. I can stand here all day. Yes, sir.
So with your background coming from DoD and what you're currently working on, have you noticed, or hopefully it's the floodgates are starting to open a little bit with whether it's FBI or other IC entities actually briefing leaders of various industries on how to improve their cyber programs? Because what I've noticed is there seems to be a disconnect from DoD regulations and hardening practices to other industries.
Yeah, so partnering is really important. But let me bring this out first, and this is not meant to be a criticism. It's just about awareness. So I was at Secret Service for 4 years as a CIO. Enjoyed that job tremendously. But it is very common for the service to respond when asked. If an industry, a vertical, a sector, or a company calls out to the local field office of the Secret Service and says, come on in, please, we need your help. We'd like to understand better what's going on, the service will show up. But you'd be amazed at how many private sector people, academia, are unaware of the willingness of the federal government to come talk and share. Now, obviously, there's a national security side, and that was a phenomenal place to be for the time that I was in it. Some things you just can't talk about unless you have the right tickets, and I understand that. But outreach is part of the federal job. Now, there might not be enough people to go around, but there is a willingness for federal agencies to talk. That aside, I don't think we can survive without finding partners on both sides of the fence. It is critical. I was thinking about this morning coming up on the train. How and where does the cyber world engage both domestically and internationally as NATO does internationally? Now, I'm not looking for a debate on whether or not NATO is valuable. That's not my point. My point is that there is a body of collaboration with national investment and national attention. Is that where cyber defense is today? I'll leave that question for you. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the sharing is continuing and it's becoming more robust. What scares me is the volumetrics of bad guys and how much is coming back over the bulkhead. The old adage of you can't turn the tide back with a teaspoon. It's worse. It's worse.
I might be able to add to your question where I think, Mike, you'll lend your expertise. Homeland Security has a computer readiness department, and I'll give you an example. So the day the vulnerability that Equifax suffered from, which was back in March, I think 6th-ish, somewhere around there, this computer readiness department goes around to all critical infrastructure and they say, okay, here's the vulnerability, here's the solution. Are you guys good to go? Yes. And in actual fact, and this is why there is a criminal negligence investigation by the FBI right now with them, is because they said, yes, good to go. Now, have I understood that mildly correctly, Mike?
Yeah, you have. As it relates to critical infrastructure, there has been a much better sharing. The challenge, of course, is the old the statistic it constantly changes, but anywhere between 70 and 80% of the cyber assets are owned by the private industry. And so you're going to go to critical infrastructure, but then what about everybody else? You know, the other thing that I'll share with, I just was able to, the governor just appointed me to the New York Power Authority. In fact, we have our cyber expert from the Power Authority here with us. But years ago, I attended a program in Orlando where we, after the attack in California, which on the power station, that it was with sniper fire and it was with cutting the cables in the vault. The FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, came out, actually it was NERC, they came out with standards, the NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection 14. And a part of that was that you would focus on the critical infrastructure side from the physical side, but then also the cyber side. And so I'm sitting in a room, and there's about 50 security officers from utilities across the country. And the guy from NERC sits there and says, and you know, by the way, you've also got cyber under this as well. And you're responsible for your vendors. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in the room. He said, how could we be responsible for our vendors' upstream, downstream liability? And what they recognized was that they need tremendous help to be able to do that and manage that, which means they got to go out to the community and find out what is the right solution. And it was funny. So the guy from NERC says, and if you don't know what a zero-day exploit is, or your vendors don't know what a zero-day exploit is, then you're really starting from behind. And I had a guy of a major utility down South Carolina and says, what the hell is that? Uh-oh. You know, and these are guys who were in charge of security at the utilities. So we have one idea of what the capability is. I promise you, whatever our ideas are, the public is much higher. Everyone believes that someone's got this cyber problem fixed, that they're going to be able to respond, and they're all shocked. What do you mean Equifax could get hacked? That can't happen. So to get back to your question, you know, there is the government is pretty robust and has gotten a lot better, though they still can't come. We have the NIST standards, and that's about as far as we're going to go in terms of actually providing a framework to respond to and comply with. But we haven't gone past that because the goalposts keep changing, and that's the challenge for the private sector.
That's right.
How do I apply resources in a way that is sustainable and is going to provide me with long-lasting security? No one really has the answer to that.
Right.
Can I add to that? That's a great point. And so here's the conundrum for somebody like me who's been a long-term government person. Truth be told, I went to Washington in 1984 to work for the government for 1 year. 33 years later, I sit before you, right? Government does some things exceptionally well. And you be the judge of what I mean by this. When it comes to trying to establish standards and bring people together to simplify and stratify challenges and issues and get everybody on the same page, it takes us a while, but then there's a nobleness in the mission of trying to bring government agencies together so that you can more effectively deal with challenges. But the conundrum is this: when you do that, everybody knows where you are, right? Creating a standard allows you to deal with adversaries as a team, but it also puts a big flashing light right on the top of your forehead saying, here's where we are. How do you deal with that? How do you make that choice? So I agree with you. Industry, motivated by different things often. When it comes to management, we're very similar. But when it comes to incentives, there are things that are different operationally. Margin comes into play and things like that. And so when you go after a point solution because your shareholders or the board says, go solve this problem, we're going to go sell more product, or we've got to make numbers, how do you deal with that? And so I say a conundrum. It's a Gordian knot that just continues tying itself back into a tighter knot when you try to unravel it. So anyway, just wanted to add to that. I agree with with Mike completely.
Well, we can close out that thought with you just adding to the complacency that Mike was talking about a little earlier. Okay, you got a question where, and I'll give you an example. In 2013, but this gets such little media coverage, it's just bizarre to me. It was Assistant Attorney General John Carlin accused the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Cyber Guards. I always have to remember, it's such a big, long mouthful. But they claim credit for attacking the Bowman Avenue Dam. I don't know if you remember this. This was just 19 miles north. I got a few nodding heads in this room. Sure, and having even maybe 10% of nodding heads should be more, but in most rooms that's zero. Most people haven't heard of that. Now the only reason they didn't cause a flood that day is because the sluice gate had been disconnected for manual repairs. So but the Homeland Security Group, to answer your question, does have this computer readiness department. Yes, sir.
So I have a question. I think we're all in agreement that in order for a security program to work, you need leadership and governance. But in many of these organizations, you have a security team with a mid-level security manager who knows what they're doing, but they report back up to the C-level suite who don't necessarily have the education or the background to run the security program. How does a mid-level security person suggest to their C-level suite to get more training or education to be experts in what they're trying to governance and manage without getting fired?
That's a great. Can I just take a stab at this?
Yes,
so
please.
I've actually, so that breach of the financial institution, what we did was we came back and we said, all right, so this is what you ought to do. And so the best way to do it is to get the C-suite to just consider a penetration test. Yeah. That is the absolute best way. And you sit there and say, oh my God, who is going to want people to come inside? So here's a free tip. I'm an attorney as well. Do a penetration test under the auspices of your general counsel. Why? Because then anything you find comes under privilege. That's right. It mitigates the concern about opening the kimono. So if you do a penetration test, and you can do it very discreetly, you can only do it on one sector, and my suggestion is you do it on a sector that is offline, but yet, and is not regulated, if they're in a regulated business, like PCI compliance, don't do it in the credit card shop. And you do it offline, and then you show them what threats and what vulnerabilities are in just that one area, then you can expand it out. But the biggest problem is that IT is still separate from security. And the IT guys are like, no, we got this, we not have to do it. And they see it as a separate box. That's one of the biggest cultural changes you have to make within an organization.
So depending on where you are in your chain, in your organization, has a lot to do with your responsibilities. I would challenge you, as I have said, you need to understand exactly what the playing field is, what the ecosystem is. You've got to be more aware. You've got to be more than a cyber or an IA, right? You've got to be more than that individual. And that means also that you have to find yourself educating people and winning people over so that they can join your agenda. I managed to get IT security, we'll just use that loose term, moved up into the #1 slot in our strategic plan. Now, there's no accolades for that, it's just my job, okay? But to Mike's point, we got everybody to pay attention by doing a pen test. And my best advocate was the person who owned it, general counsel. Why? Because she understood the sensitivity he's talking about, and she was astute enough to listen, and I didn't have to educate her because she paid attention to my predecessor. And she was bright enough to understand the significance of IT failure. The agency had been through a breach prior to my arrival, and she paid attention. So when it came to game day, she took it. We fought for it a little bit because I wanted to own it. Yeah. And she prevailed, and she convinced me as general counsel that she should own the pen test. And everybody paid attention. Everyone paid attention. Kudos to her for standing up and showing backbone. She absolutely said, I got this. And she took over because she had become schooled in the significance of IT and even more aware of IT failure. Great point.
More questions? Did I see a hand? No?
Nope.
Yes, sir.
Just one quick thing. I think we all understand that there's a relationship between the government providing, having a good relationship, the government having a good relationship with companies and some of the standards you mentioned. But the government, frankly, has its own problems as well, where they're getting breached. We've seen hacks of government entities Do you think that plays a bit into the industry's, I don't know, aversion to some of the partnerships and whatnot? Because clearly the government is having problems. Well, why should we listen to you, for example?
So and they were just reflecting on an earlier question about information sharing from the government to the commercial space. Collaboration does not work without it being a two-way street. That if information sharing is unidirectional, then the outcomes will be what we would expect them to be. When tech organizations like Facebook and Google, Amazon, et cetera, the security vendor industry that I'm a part of as well, when we participate in clear and transparent collaboration, the results are much more aligned with what we would expect. And that's something that needs to be, that I think is not reinforced enough, that unless it's part of some marketing alliance or some type of strictly sales-based initiative, that there's maybe not the right focus on it or attention to it. But beneath the covers, there needs to be deep collaboration, and that's some of the things. Checkpoint is happens to be an Israeli-based cybersecurity company, so the company lives in a rough neighborhood. So in many cases, we're the tip of the spear in terms of seeing what's active from a government-sponsored attack perspective. So we see some of the worst things earliest. But we do have high levels of collaboration with both state, federal, and local governments internationally. So we have partnerships with U.S. CERT and EU CERT. We have partnerships with DHS around some of the information sharing of what we see, because the power of where we are from an innovation perspective is the ability to accelerate change and to decrease the lifespan of any individual attack. So traditionally speaking, the cost of defense is very high and the cost of attack is very low. And as long as that imbalance or lack of equilibrium exists, we're going to continue to see high volumes of attacks with us chasing the soccer ball across the field to try and respond. But what can change that equation is increasing the cost of attack. Now, what increases the cost of attack? Forcing the bad guys to go back into their tool bag because what they tried yesterday doesn't work today, and forcing them to create new and varied attacks. So being able to increase the transparency and information flow and collaboration of threat intelligence services will be an effective mitigating factor. It's necessary but not sufficient. So what we see is that when we have this type of information sharing, we more quickly identify threats, both external and pre-existing compromised environments. So we're able to identify these artifacts in a much greater accelerated fashion. So that's something that I think is perhaps underreported on, but something that we need to expand on. But again, as Mike touched on earlier, until people care, there's not going to be the requisite level of focus on it.
So if I could just take a specific response to you, and just show out a practical aspect of why people don't trust government. People are very afraid that if they get hacked and they call the FBI, what's the FBI going to do? They're going to come in and take their servers. They're going to shut down their systems because they want to do a forensic review. Now, how long do you think the forensic review is going to go? Do you think they're going to have rapid response over the weekend? Oh, by the way, yes, you were attacked by this group, and they took these files, and now here's what you should do: you should shore up your computer system. No way. It doesn't work like that. Even the Secret Service's capability, and Secret Service has a phenomenal cyber capability, they don't move that fast because the threats are frankly too much. In addition, who here is really confident that you could provide attribution of any attack in the short term? Really? I don't think there's the people who are really good at that. And then the last thing is this. So with the ransomware, what did we see? Nobody called the police when they got hacked. They paid the ransom. They paid the Bitcoin. Why? Because they needed the files. They had to keep their job. They had to keep their company operating. Yeah. So that's why people in the private sector really stay away from involving government. Besides the fact that you don't really always know what's on your systems. And what if your employee's been visiting Silk Road a lot and has been doing some transactional accounts? Are you responsible for that? So there's this incredible trepidation of letting the government into your systems. And frankly, their capabilities, though great in many respects, just is not going to be real time enough to keep your business going.
And just let me comment a little bit as well, and this might come across as defensive government. I'm not trying to do that. There are typically 5 bias, depending on which philosophy you read or follow, about why people make decisions and why they think what they think, and I won't go into it. But a lot of what circulates around government when it comes to services or IT or cyber defense is often biased by irrationality. And so I just plant this seed with you. Whether it's the FBI or the Secret Service, they're probably already there. You just don't know it, okay? We're probably already there. Because what law enforcement does is try to understand threats and identify bad actors, criminals, and being seen is not always the way to do it. So, in my time in government, I've never run into anyone whose agenda it was to disrupt commerce or American industry or, dig into someone's personal business. I've not met that person unless there was a reason for criminal investigation. Government does things exceptionally well. Government also does things in paces that are not responsive to industry. So I only bring that up and I say, hey, step back a little bit, reevaluate what you think might be going on in government, be a little more open-minded and ask some questions. You might be surprised at what you find, but I was at Secret Service when Target happened. How long was the FBI knowledgeable about Equifax? Putting handcuffs on somebody is just kind of the last step in a process. It's not the first one. So I'll just leave it at that.
More questions? It's a bashful crowd. All right, we're getting going here.
Just exactly what you said. Putting handcuffs on is the last step in the process. When do you think we're going to start seeing people actually get handcuffs as opposed to retirements with golden parachutes?
Not touching that one.
Hey, how about the moderator touch that one?
Oh.
You know what's interesting though is that I think that is going to be inevitable at some point, because we're going to have to at some point. People do carry responsibility, right? And with that responsibility comes accountability. And so that at some point we're going to have to say, look, you are well enough prepared. So I think the infancy, and maybe it's not an infancy, of the computer readiness department that goes around and makes sure everybody's doing their job, and the fact that they got a thumbs up when really it should have been a thumbs down from Equifax, this is an interesting one. So this is, to my knowledge, the first time I'm seeing a very serious criminal investigation. So we'll see on that one. It's inevitable, my friend.
Let me dig myself out of the hole when I made my comment about not touching that. I think for it being the federal guy up here, I think one of the most dangerous jobs in Washington D.C. right now is to be a CIO or a CTO, because it's going to be your fault, right? As a program manager in DoD, I learned about accountability. You got to be accountable. You got to be willing to step up, and you got to be willing to be held accountable. You're seeing that today, right? The departures of CIOs, both in industry and government, is an example of what's happening. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not people deserve it, but it's starting to be noticed. Right, wrong, or otherwise, it is happening. Yeah. When it comes to criminals, that's a different question, right? That's a whole different animal. This is a very dynamic and fluid place. Back in my early career in DoD, I was in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, and we didn't know how to deal with those situations. There was a time that the U.S. and Russia, or the Soviet Union, dealt with chemical warfare as a mutually assured destruction algorithm. The Geneva Convention was grappling with what it all meant. We're in a similar place when it comes to cyber, right? What are the policies? What does it mean to actually go to war? I was in the intelligence community during 9/11. What was that when the World Trade Center came down? So the policy and the politics and the morality of all of this is struggling to keep up. How you hold people accountable and the consequences of being held accountable for being in a job, whether you were negligent or not, or party to a failure. I think we understand that superficially. I don't think we understand that in the depths of truly understanding the chain of custody and accountability. Clearly, somebody's got to be held accountable, and you're seeing people held accountable now. You deal with a lot of them, Mike.
So, one of the things I think, if we were sitting in a room and you were going to walk away from the session and say, well, what was the trend we identified? Is this a growing market? We always say, oh, look at the cyber spend. It's only going up. Even if it's only 9%, it's still going up. If you take a look at what the appropriations for Homeland Security have been lately, it is going up. But your question goes to the development of awareness within the C-suite. We could go to the question before, but how do you get someone from the lower level to get it up to the higher level? But tell you what, I chair a board on a private company, and I know, if we went public, it'd be Sarbanes-Oxley. And what are the responsibilities and shareholders' derivative actions? Right. And there's an evolution that's happening now. And so in terms of the criminal liability, yes, that's the ultimate driver. We may never get there unless you run critical infrastructure. There may not be that kind of responsibility we, as a society, we place on people in a private industry. But as soon as someone coming from the federal government, an investigative agency like the FBI, and they knock on your door and they ask you questions, if you tell them the wrong answers and you intentionally lie to them, well, Martha Stewart found out what the responses were. And so right now people aren't asking those questions. That's the thing. Right now the law enforcement interface on the cyber issue is still reactive. You get hacked, you call them, you tell them what's going on, maybe there's a downstream, upstream liability, let's find out what's going on. We haven't had that kind of conversation yet where law enforcement comes and says, well, wait a minute, what did you do? But it's going to be driven by the shareholder derivative actions. That's going to start coming. And that's going to build your business, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to know, this is what I tell people, this is a growing, burgeoning body of business. And that's because there's a lot of pie on the table. You don't have to own it all, just need a little piece, because people are going to need your expertise. And they're going to need you to understand how they do business and how you can make sure that they have the continuity of operations. And so all these things are going to drive awareness and responsibility.
There was another question in that direction, I believe. Yes, sir.
So this was asked earlier today with the OWAF, the opening keynote speaker. But just given the diverse background that the three of you have, I kind of wanted to put it to you. Law enforcement tactician, an expert engineer, and an elected official and advocate. Where does the role of backdoor play within the security products and technology in the 21st century?
So I'll take the first stab at that and pass along to my colleagues. So it's an understandable concern. Recently, the U.S. federal government banned Kaspersky as an AV solution for federal systems. So it's a just concern. In terms of the response, and this touches on the perhaps some of the criminal negligence and the viability of that for certain officers of an organization. That are you taking reasonable protective measures? Because there is no bulletproof system. There is no system that's impervious to compromise. Given the level of sophistication of the defending organization relative to the sophistication of the attacking institution, whether it's an institution or an individual, there may be large disparities in that. So, we should not be looking at this through the lens scope of what's a utopic model that will leave me fully protected, because there is no such thing. What are the reasonable and practical protections that I could implement that my team can operationalize and consume, and that I can scale the operating business, not the security piece, the operating business of the institution, whatever that institution's organizational goal is, right? Because at the end of the day, You can put an alarm on your car, and you can have the club. I think I'm dating myself perhaps a bit, but there was such a thing, this big metal bar that you would put across your steering wheel that looked ridiculous, but nonetheless, it made you less attractive. But at the end of the day, if someone wants your car, they're still going to get your car, right? They'll cut the steering wheel in half so they can slide the bar off, right? But at the end of the day, what are the reasonable measures that you're implementing that you're able to take advantage of and operationalize with the group and the resources at your avail? And where are you making a difference? And in the commercial space, there's essentially two levers that top-down management look at. How are we increasing efficiencies, and how are we increasing effectiveness? And at the end of the day, if the security operations is aligned with those two goals, is every vendor, like the chip manufacturer that's in a piece of firmware from let's say a power station that was built in the 70s, is that going to be susceptible? Maybe yes, maybe no. But at the end of the day, are you taking reasonable and just protections to make sure that you have sound practices within your organization? That's the only thing we could really do.
That's the answer.
Yeah,
Good answer.
I agree. Let me give you a perspective from a customer. Okay, if I'm bringing you in your company, and you represent the other side of the aisle, right? You're coming from industry. I already know that if I'm senior enough and the program's big enough, I'm going to be held accountable, and I'm going to hold you accountable too, as a provider of that service. And I draw this from some work I did in the federal government on program managers. There's a lot of thought, theory, and practice on program management. I'm a believer in the DoD style of management. And we can quibble about that over a glass of wine. But a significant player in program management in DoD typically starts out as an engineer or a weapons operator. As they rise up through the ranks, they need to understand logistics, test, acquisition, maybe a little bit of public affairs. They have to become a jack of all trades and understand everything. Because program managers have a life cycle and a confluence of resources and assets that come together for an outcome. The cyber discipline is the same thing today. And I'm going to turn to you and say, what rigor did you apply to the solution? I'm not the smart guy in the room, you are when it comes to the cyber technology or the cyber defense or the countermeasure. You're the smart guy, but I've got to look at assets, acquisition, logistics, training, education, support, the entire ball of wax. I'm going to ask you for the same thing. And so if it's a backdoor issue or if it's a supplier issue, what have you done, what have you expressed in time and energy with regard to due diligence to make sure that your chain top to bottom and east to west is secure, safe, and sound? That's why I say the world of cyber, at least in government, is changing dramatically. It's not about features and capabilities. It's about end-to-end life cycle and platform response. And then you bring in risk tolerance and the rest of it. You bring all of that in and you run whatever algorithm you want, you figure out where your problems are, and then you stand up and you be counted with me. That's my perspective as a customer. We will succeed together or we will fail together. And those are the consequences, those are the stakes in today's big programs. And if you're up to it, then jump on board. Companies, organizations, educational institutions need good people who want to go for the ride. And we're clamoring for those people to join up and get on board and put it all in. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it's a perspective as a consumer, as a customer, from those of you who provide solutions. It's not just a channel or a sliver. It's the entire spectrum of what goes into that platform.
Yes, ma'am.
Looking at something from a financial standpoint, I just want to mention that I believe that CFOs and CEOs can be prosecuted by the SEC if they put in a material misstatement on their financial statements. And I'm wondering whether something like that can be done with CIOs or CISOs by the SEC, because that would materially misstate the internal controls of a company if it's not known public in the financial statements by the external auditors.
Well, actually, there's it's an interesting question. The challenge is that, for example, in the Target breach, Target initially was not the source of the breach. It was a small operations supply company, and the SEC only has jurisdictional providence over public companies, let's say. So, in that case, could Target plausibly point the finger at this much smaller mom and pop shop that does not have the capacity to really defend itself or justify this expensive, robust security infrastructure? And I'm not answering. It's somewhat of a rhetorical response, but it raises the question of when you begin to follow the trail of breadcrumbs of the source of these things. Responsibility lies with the victim on some level, but it also lies with the aggressor or the attacking actor in this case. And until there's increased capacity to mitigate both sides equally, to address the attacking agent or actor, as well as respond with discretionary controls on the defense side, that again, this lack of equilibrium is going to perpetuate the problems getting worse, right? You think about autonomous vehicles and E-enabled aircraft. The FDA, I was just mentioning earlier, had a recall on Bluetooth pacemakers. Why? Well, because if you're in a 30-foot radius, you could artificially change what the battery life is reporting on a Bluetooth pacemaker. So what's the effect there? Is it is it the manufacturer's problem? Is it the doctor's problem? Is it the hospital's problem? It is a problem, but until we create better equilibrium between attribution and accountability, the problems will continue to get worse.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
So as you know, there are only a couple of silos of responsibility that the federal government has placed, SEC compliance being one of them, PCI compliance, and then HIPAA. So if you take a look at the case law surrounding the HIPAA liability, it's all about data breach. It's all about data revelation of patient information, protected patient information. What you're seeing now, of course, is what blends into the critical infrastructure of the SCADA control and manipulation. But as we're going forward, the question is not so much as to whether or not there's an individual who's responsible. It's whether or not there is a corporate governance question, as we talked about beforehand. And you're going to see that being driven more and more as the breaches become bigger and people lose more money. Right now, as you know, there have really not been any successful class action suits for people whose data has been breached. That's because you don't know how to cost out what the damages are. You can't have a lawsuit without damages. That's going to change. And you also have to certify it as a class. You can't just have one person sue. Judges in the federal court are just beginning to start certifying classes. When you see that and it becomes like a shareholder's derivative action, that's going to drive change and accountability.
But can I also say, I think I watched a congressional hearing with regards to the Equifax. The head honcho had to answer some questions built into the standard contract, which was that somebody had to go through mandatory arbitration before they go and they move forward with the lawsuit. So he claimed that it was standard pro forma boilerplate information that they subsequently took out when they got some heat. So that can't be in there with these kinds of things as well, that the liability, they're free of the liability, or you can't sue these people because they already built in some sort of safeguard to protect the board of directors.
No, that's very true, and of course they have insurance policies but again, it depends upon what the breach is, depends on what the loss is. Arbitrations can result in enormous liability.
And to Mike's point, we're starting to see this in Europe already, right? GDPR is going to be effective next year. General data privacy regulations, where private organizations, commercial institutions will be held accountable for data loss and security incidents. So, I typically don't like to lean on governance or regulatory requirements as the threshold or barrier to entry, because in many cases it's the lowest threshold just to provide necessary compliance or the appropriate checkbox. But we will see an increase in this, and as I mentioned, it's already happening in Europe, and it will come here. The Equifax issue is going to change the entire industry because the billions of dollars that are going to now be required to go into that to adhere, and the Federal Trade Commission is already investigating appropriate responses from a regulatory perspective to secure these things. So the cost to the industry is going to be immense, and as a result of these what I would otherwise characterize lowest common denominator regulations, there will be enforceable metrics, and accountability will increase as a byproduct of that.
There's a
Thank
question
you.
over here.
Not as much a question as an observation, and that is that we're going down the road of all the negative messages that we can give to the C-suite. You will be before a congressional committee. You will be on the cover of Name Your Periodical, dancing up and down with your stock trade. I think where we can get the message across to the C-suite, certainly you can lead with the stick if you want, but think about the brilliant person who came up with pre-owned versus a used car. Because if you owned a used car, it was like, oh, you couldn't afford a new one, as opposed to, oh, yes, I have a pre-owned vehicle, and it suddenly sounded better. Sustainability is now a marketing initiative. Why isn't security by design a marketing initiative? Why aren't vendors thinking and presenting to the C-suite, part of our marketing pitch should be, look what we've done. We can't guarantee, because there's no such thing, but we take it seriously. And let us show you, as part of our marketing pitch, how we've done this. And now suddenly, it's not just a cost center, it's a potential business getting, profit sort of generating center. And I think that's a better message for the C-suite if you want to get that message at least heard in the first instance.
Great point.
No, it's a great point. Great point.
Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think are we right at time? Yeah, we're right at time. Okay. All right, well, we're right at time. I'm certainly continuing a little bit of this dialogue in my session at 4 o'clock in one of the rooms, so that'll be good fun. And you've seen contact details if you want to get in touch with any of our experts here today for more questions or dialogue. Thank you very much for your time, everybody.